I had always dreamed of owning my own home, a place to call my sanctuary after years of apartment living. After months of browsing listings, visiting open houses, and endless meetings with realtors, I finally found a house that seemed perfect. It was an old, charming two-story on the edge of a quiet neighborhood, tucked away behind tall trees and set back from the road. The price was reasonable considering the location and the size, and the realtor assured me it was a great investment. The house was built in the 1950s with wood paneling inside and a fireplace that looked like it hadn't been used in decades. I imagined cozy evenings by the fire, filling the rooms with warmth and laughter. The backyard was a decent size, with space for a small garden I had always wanted. The neighborhood was quiet, with families and couples who seemed to have lived there for years. When I walked through the front door for the first time, the air smelled of dust and old wood. The floor creaked beneath my feet, and sunlight filtered softly through faded curtains. The house was empty, except for a few pieces of leftover furniture and a faded portrait hanging crookedly on the wall. I felt an odd chill, but I shrugged it off. Maybe it was just the unfamiliarity of the place. The previous owner, an elderly woman named Mrs. Collins, had lived there alone for decades before moving to assisted living. The realtor said she'd kept the house mostly as it was, hoping someone with care and patience would restore it. I liked that idea. A house with history, waiting to be brought back to life. After a thorough inspection, which thankfully revealed no major structural issues, I signed the papers and got the keys. That day, holding the keys in my hand, a strange mix of excitement and nervousness flooded me. It was the start of a new chapter. The first night in the house was unsettling. Despite the warmth of my new bedding and the soft glow of the bedside lamp, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The old floorboards creaked and groaned as if whispering secrets in the dark. Shadows seemed to flicker just beyond my vision, and strange noises, soft thumps and sighs, echoed through the silent rooms. I told myself it was just the house settling, old pipes, or the wind brushing against the windows. But sleep was elusive. The days that followed were busy. I spent hours unpacking boxes, arranging furniture, and cleaning layers of dust from hidden corners. There was something oddly satisfying about making the old house my own, hanging up my pictures, placing potted plants on windowsills, filling shelves with books. Each room slowly began to feel less foreign. But as the house grew more familiar, the strange occurrences became harder to ignore. Little things at first. I'd set my keys on the kitchen counter only to find them later on the hallway table. My phone would be on the charger, but I'd discover it resting on the floor across the room. Once, I returned from the grocery store and found the front door wide open, even though I was sure I'd locked it. I tried to rationalize it all. Maybe I was just distracted from the stress of moving. Maybe it was muscle memory from my old apartment, putting things in the wrong place without realizing. I even blamed the wind for the open door. But one evening, while arranging books in the small upstairs study, I heard a faint voice, a low murmur, almost like someone speaking in another room. I froze, listening hard, my pulse racing. The voice was so soft it was hard to tell where it came from. I checked every room, even the basement, but found nothing. That night, I had a vivid dream. I was standing in the hallway, the walls dark and pulsing as if they were alive. A woman stood at the end of the corridor, her back turned to me. She wore a long nightgown, her hair hanging in gray strands down her shoulders. When she slowly turned, I woke up with a start, heart pounding, sweat chilling my skin. I couldn't remember her face, just the overwhelming sense of sorrow that clung to her. In the following days, small cold spots formed in random areas of the house. I'd be brushing my teeth and feel an icy draft crawl across my shoulders, only to look up and see the bathroom window firmly shut. The creaking floorboards started to sound less like random groans and more deliberate, like careful footsteps. Neighbors would wave politely when I passed, but their smiles were tight, almost pitying. One afternoon, the elderly man from next door, Mr. Harold, paused by my driveway while I was weeding. "You bought the old Collins place, huh?" he said, adjusting his cap. "Yes," I smiled, though suddenly unsure. He hesitated, eyes narrowing as if debating whether to say more. "Well, just be careful. That house has seen a lot of lonely years. Loneliness can make a place strange." Then he walked off, leaving me with a pit in my stomach. That evening, I started leaving the hallway light on at night, just in case. A week later, the atmosphere in the house began to change in ways I couldn't ignore. It felt denser somehow, as if the very air was thicker, making it hard to breathe deeply. Sometimes it smelled faintly of damp earth, even though it hadn't rained in days. One evening, I decided to tackle the attic. The narrow staircase creaked under my weight, and dust swirled in lazy clouds as I pushed the old wooden door open. The attic was dim, lit only by the late afternoon sun filtering through a small round window. Boxes and old trunks lined the walls, draped with yellowing sheets. Cobwebs hung like lace curtains. I started to explore, curious to see what remnants of the previous owner were left behind. Inside an old cedar chest, I found stacks of faded letters tied with delicate ribbon, their ink smudged and fragile. Most were from decades ago, filled with affectionate lines from a man named Thomas, addressed to "My dearest Margaret." The final letters were less cheerful. Words like loneliness, grief, and unbearable silence appeared often. As I set the last bundle aside, something cold brushed against my hand, so cold it burned. I recoiled, heart racing, and the attic seemed to darken for a brief moment, shadows crowding the edges of my vision. A faint whisper, almost a sigh, passed right by my ear. I stumbled out of the attic, slamming the door behind me, trying to calm my hammering chest. That night was the first time I saw her clearly. I woke to the creak of my bedroom door opening. Moonlight spilled across the floor, illuminating a figure standing by the foot of my bed. The same woman from my dream. Wispy hair, long nightgown, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. Her face was pale, eyes dark and hollow, watching me with a mournful expression. I couldn't move. My voice caught in my throat as she slowly lifted one hand, pointing toward the hallway. Then she vanished. Not like fading smoke, but simply gone, leaving the air painfully cold where she had stood. Shaking, I sat up and turned on every light in the house. I stayed awake until dawn, gripping a mug of tea that had long gone cold, trying to convince myself it was a stress-induced hallucination. But deep down, I knew. This house wasn't empty, and I wasn't alone. The next day, I visited the local library to look up old property records and any articles about the house. I learned that Margaret Collins had lived here alone after her husband Thomas died suddenly in the 1970s. Neighbors mentioned how she grew reclusive, rarely seen outside, her lights burning late into the night. Some hinted she'd been waiting for Thomas to come back. I returned home with a gnawing sense of pity mixed with fear. Maybe the house hadn't let go of Margaret's sorrow, or maybe she was still here, searching for something or someone. The days that followed were a blur of restless sleep and rising dread. I tried to keep myself occupied, fixing creaky hinges, painting over old stains, tending a small patch of flowers by the porch, anything to ignore the feeling of being watched. But every evening, the house would seem to close in around me. The cold spots grew larger, spreading through the hallways and lingering in the living room where the old fireplace stood dark and empty. At night, I'd hear sobbing, faint but unmistakable. Sometimes it sounded like it was right outside my bedroom door. I'd clutch the blankets to my chest, paralyzed, too afraid to move. One particularly stormy evening, as rain lashed against the windows and wind howled through the trees, everything came to a head. I was reading on the couch, trying to distract myself, when I heard heavy footsteps upstairs. Not the soft creaks of an old house settling, but deliberate, measured steps. My breath caught, I strained to listen. The steps moved from one end of the upstairs hall to the other, then paused directly above me. Then came the sound of weeping. It was closer, more desperate than before. My heart thundered painfully in my chest. I stood, nearly dropping my book, and forced myself up the stairs. Each step felt like wading through water, my legs heavy with dread. The hallway was dim, lit only by a single lamp. At the far end, the door to the attic stood ajar. I don't know why I walked toward it, part curiosity, part compulsion, as if something was drawing me in. I pushed the door open and climbed the attic steps. Inside, the attic was freezing. My breath fogged in front of me. I turned in a slow circle, then froze. In the corner stood Margaret. Her head was bowed, her shoulders shaking with sobs. Summoning every ounce of courage, I whispered, "Margaret?" Her head snapped up. For a heartbeat, her hollow eyes locked on mine, and a wave of sorrow and longing so profound it nearly knocked me to my knees washed over me. Her mouth opened, soundless at first, then a hoarse whisper escaped. "Thomas, have you come home?" Tears sprang to my eyes. I shook my head, voice cracking. "I'm not Thomas. I'm so sorry." Her expression twisted, grief deepening into something close to agony. The room grew impossibly cold, shadows swirling around her like a living shroud. The sobbing returned, echoing off the attic walls, rising to a piercing wail that made me clamp my hands over my ears. Suddenly, the attic window shattered inward. Glass sprang across the floor. Wind roared through the attic, whipping papers and dust into a frenzied cyclone. I stumbled back, slipping on shards, heart hammering wildly. Then, just as abruptly as it started, the wind died. The attic fell silent. Margaret was gone. I fled down the stairs, locking myself in my bedroom for the rest of the night, tears sliding down my cheeks. I finally understood. Margaret wasn't trying to frighten me. She was trapped here, searching for the man she lost, her sorrow anchoring her to this world. But even with that understanding, I knew I couldn't live like this forever. The next morning, I awoke exhausted, my body aching as though I'd been through a physical battle. The memory of Margaret's anguished face clung to me like a damp shroud. I knew I couldn't ignore this anymore. I needed help. Someone who might understand what I was dealing with. I reached out to a local historian, Mrs. Greenway, who specialized in the town's older properties. When she arrived that afternoon, she seemed a little surprised by how pale and shaken I must have looked. Over tea in my kitchen, I poured out everything: the cold spots, the sobbing, the attic encounter. Her expression darkened with each detail. "That house has always been a sad place," she said gently. "After Thomas Collins died suddenly of a heart attack, Margaret fell into a deep despair. She wrote to him every day, leaving his favorite chair set at the dining table, waiting for him to come home. Some neighbors tried to help, but she refused to leave. It was as though she thought if she just stayed, he might walk through the door again." I felt a lump form in my throat. "But why is she still here?" Mrs. Greenway placed a comforting hand over mine. "Sometimes love is so strong it becomes a chain. Grief can twist it into something that holds a soul back. Margaret never accepted his death, never allowed herself to let go. She suggested we try to help Margaret move on, not with grand rituals, but with something simpler and more human: acknowledgement. Together, we gathered some of Margaret's old letters from the attic, along with the small locket I had found tucked in one of the trunks, containing a tiny photo of Thomas. That evening, as dusk fell and shadows pooled in the corners of the house, we stood together in the living room. I lit a few candles, the soft flames casting gentle light on the faded walls. Holding the locket, I spoke aloud, voice trembling at first but growing steadier. "Margaret, I know how much you loved Thomas. I've read your words. I've felt your sorrow in these walls, but he's gone. And it's time for you to be with him again, wherever that might be." For a moment, there was nothing. Then the air grew inexplicably warmer, almost tender. A faint scent of lavender drifted by, and I thought I heard a quiet sigh, not of sorrow this time, but relief. The candles flickered, as if stirred by an unseen hand, then steadied. Mrs. Greenway squeezed my shoulder. "I think she heard you." That night, for the first time since moving in, I slept deeply and peacefully. No sobbing in the halls, no icy drafts or ghostly footsteps. Just the gentle creak of an old house settling into quiet rest. The next morning, sunlight streamed through my windows, brighter and warmer than it had ever seemed before. I wandered through the house with a cautious hope. The heavy feeling that had clung to every room was gone, replaced by a subtle lightness, as if the very walls had sighed in relief. I paused at the attic door, half expecting to feel the cold press of unseen grief. But it was simply an attic now, dusty, full of forgotten things, yet empty of sorrow. In the weeks that followed, the change in the house became undeniable. It was as though a great tension had finally lifted, leaving behind only calm. The air felt cleaner, the rooms brighter. Even the floorboards seemed to sigh with contentment instead of sorrow. I spent my mornings on the porch with a cup of coffee, listening to birdsong and the gentle rustle of leaves. The neighbors who once seemed wary stopped by more often. Mrs. Harper from across the street brought over a pie one afternoon, smiling warmly. Even old Mr. Harold waved with genuine cheer as he worked in his garden. Without realizing it, I had become part of the neighborhood, woven into the quiet rhythm of their lives. Inside, I made the house truly my own. I painted the living room a soft sage green, hung cheerful prints in the hallway, and filled the kitchen with the scent of fresh herbs and simmering meals. At night, I would sit by the old fireplace, now cleaned and functional, reading by the firelight with a blanket tucked around me. The house no longer felt haunted. It felt alive, like it was finally breathing again. Sometimes I still thought of Margaret. I imagined her and Thomas together, wherever they might be, finally reunited after all those lonely years. When I found little remnants of her life, a dried flower pressed between book pages, a slip of handwritten poetry tucked in a drawer, I smiled and set them gently in a small keepsake box. A quiet tribute, not to the ghost who lingered, but to the love that had once been so strong it refused to fade. As the seasons turned, I started planting a garden in the backyard, just like I had always dreamed. Lavender, daisies, roses, bright splashes of life that brought bees and butterflies fluttering through the yard. Some evenings, I'd catch myself talking softly to the blooms, telling them about my day, my hopes, my plans. It was a simple happiness, but one that filled my chest with a tender, grateful warmth. I even hosted a little housewarming dinner one autumn evening. Friends and neighbors gathered around my dining table, laughter echoing through the house, wine glasses clinking. At one point, I looked around at all the glowing faces and felt tears sting my eyes. Not from fear, but from an overwhelming sense of belonging. Later that night, after everyone had left and the house stood quiet again, I wandered room to room, touching the walls lightly. "Thank you," I whispered. Whether to the house or to something beyond, I wasn't quite sure. I climbed into bed and fell asleep with a peaceful heart, dreaming not of sorrowful ghosts, but of gardens in bloom, sunlight streaming through open windows, and laughter that would one day fill these rooms again. At last, this house was truly a home, and so was I.